It is my pleasure to now have Dirk Pleiter from Jülich Supercomputing Centre. I wanted to just note for people that are here that the presentation that Dirk is going to be presenting on is from brain research to high energy physics. So with that, Dirk.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. As you can see, I try to cover a relatively broad range of applications into which we are looking in the framework of the Nvidia Application Lab at Jülich. That's a lab which had been now in operation since more than 1 year. We established it in July last year. And the work focus is still on enabling scientific applications for GPUs to provide support for their optimization and also to focus more on applications which are not running just on a single GPU, but we need multiple GPUs. So to investigate also the scaling behaviors of these kind of applications. We have been looking at a broad range of applications. We are looking at their requirements. We're also looking into the architectures. Whenever a new generation of GPUs comes out, we compare how well the applications map onto these new architectures. And obviously also training is part of our program. Now I should give credits to two persons, Andrew Adinetz and Thierry Kraus over here, who actually did most of the work which I'm presenting here. Now before I go through a tour of applications, let me also briefly introduce you to the Uni Supercomputing and say the way how we approach HPC. Of course, on the one hand, we do operate large computing facilities. That's of course one part of our mission, but we did realize already quite some time ago that this is for a modern supercomputing center not sufficient and that we have to embed our activities into a larger scientific framework. And the key in the center of all the activities are the applications. The work on applications is organized in a set of what we call simulation labs, so that we have scientists who work on specific application domains within our institution. They, of course, have to also deal with algorithms, to be supported by performance tools. So that's the second important area. And then we have the area of technology, because in order to enable us in future to also provide exascale computing facilities, we have to have strong collaboration with vendors in order to enable these kind of architectures we need. And the Nvidia Application Lab is one part of this technology area. Now, let me start with the first application coming from computational neuroscience. And actually one of the applications which are part of the Human Brain Project, a large-scale European project which just has started in 1st of October this year. And the goal of the scientists which are working in this so-called U-Brain project is that they want to achieve a very accurate and highly detailed computer model of the human brain, basically from taking data which is derived by cutting a brain into several pieces and then making images of all these separate slices of the brain, and from these two-dimensional images they are reconstructing a three-dimensional model of that. So the key computational challenge is to do a so-called registration of these images, to fit images which are on top of each other, such that they represent, say, the original three-dimensional set of slices. Now, the simplest way of how you can imagine this to be done is the so-called rigid transformation, where basically you have three coordinates. I mean, you can either shift it in the two-dimensional space, the two dimensions, or you can have a rotation. That's certainly not sufficient. It's just for the purpose here to demonstrate what that means here, since you have also deformation of the tissues. In that way you need much more complex transformation, which may not only have 3 parameters, but maybe at the end have order 100 parameters. And the key computation which has to be done is when you fit the two images on top of each other, you have to understand how well these fit. And this is the metric which tells you how well this fits, that is based on the so-called Shannon entropy, which tells you of how much information is encoded, and this you maximize by looking at a so-called information exchange metric based on this Shannon entropy. Now, how does the workflow look like? You have two images. I mean, one is then called the fixed image, and then you have the moving image, which you try to fit on top of the fixed image. And since they might not be arrested at the same point, you first have to start to do an interpolation such that you have the pixels for both images at the same locations, and then you can compute the metric which tells you how well these two images fit on top of each other. And from this information you derive then in an optimizer the parameters for a transformation step, which in a second iteration should make the images fit even better on top of each other. Now, the metric computation, this is the compute-intensive part of this workflow, and what you're basically doing is that you're constructing histograms in order to determine, say, the probability of the different color and gray codes, which tells you how well these images fit on top of each other. And that is obviously something which is then heavily limited in terms of performance if you calculate these kind of histograms. So you're updating a shared array in the memory. It's limited by the atomic operations which you can perform. And in Kepler, that since the L2 atomics have been significantly improved, we saw a quite significant speed up of a factor of 10 when computing this metric. Now, the problem which the application developers have is that their images in the long term will not fit into a single GPU device. So they were interested to work with us in understanding of how we can actually distribute the application onto multiple GPU devices. Now, let me try to explain this in a very simplified version of what is actually done. And actually, I told you this rigid transformation, you basically have the translation in the 2 dimensions. We just assume that this is not required, but that we only have a rotation, as it is shown here in this picture. So you have here on the background, you have the fixed image, and then you have the moving image on top of it, and then you have to, and then you can rotate these two over each other. Now, if you assume that the data, as it is also, say, indicated here by these quadrants, is distributed over multiple devices, then you start to have potentially the need for accessing data which is on a remote device. And so you start to have the need for doing very fine-grained communication, and that turns out to be a bit challenging, at least with the current GPU architectures. We have been looking into 2 strategies of how to facilitate that. The first one, which we called system memory replication strategy. In this case, the device we distribute for the local part of the fixed image over the different GPU devices, but we kept a full copy of the moving image in the host device, because that is sufficiently large to hold the whole image. The other approach is that you say, okay, we distribute all the data over all of the devices for both the fixed image and the moving image, but instead of sending all of the data, we just send the local fixed image data, including information to which location is actually refers to, and then at the destination site, the actual computation of the metric has to be performed. Now let me show you some performance results. I mean, we did a comparison for both Fermi and for Kepler. And what you can see here in these 2 plots, the upper one is for Fermi. It's actually a system consisting of 4 Fermis distributed over 2 nodes, and the lower one a system with 2 Kepler K20. And the blue line, which is here, say, very much on the bottom, and here, that is the baseline if you basically run the application, replicate it on the 4 nodes, and you have no communication. This green and these red curves here, that shows you the results from the system memory approach, and the purple line, which is shown here, gives you then the list update approach. And what we can see here is that for Fermi, I mean, you see that at least for low angles, the communication doesn't play any role, so you have almost perfect scaling. You see, however, a kind of a sudden bulky approach. This can be explained by if the angle becomes larger, then you start to have different kind of memory accesses, and as a result you have much larger number of memory transfers over the PCI Express bus, which costs you a significant amount of performance then. For the Kepler architecture, it turns out that the list updates approach is much faster. The reason for that is that with the list update approach, since you have to update some shared memory structures, the L2 atomics start to play an important role. And for Fermi, I mean, this was simply a bit too slow. That's why you see here then the effect of the L2 atomic improvement again. One takeaway lesson here is that fine-grained multi-GPU communication can potentially be quite tricky, and it's worthwhile, I mean, to explore different strategies to parallelize it. Now let us go to a next application. BCALM stands for the Belgium California Light Machine. The research goal of the investigators for this application was to simulate electromagnetic fields in matter. So basically you are solving the Maxwell equations. And they are interested in terms of their research, first of all, to look into optimizing nanophotonics for optical interconnect, so something which is of, say, immediate interest for our community here at SC. And at Jülich we have a second group which is working on optimized photovoltaic, so to look into optimized energy power generation in the future. And the method which they use is the so-called finite difference time domain method. In this method, I mean, you distribute the electrical and magnetic fields in a regular grid, in a staggered way, and you update them in a staggered way by solving a discretized version of the Maxwell equations. Now, the challenge which the application developers did have is that they wanted to solve actually very large systems where you have 4,000 square times 400 grid points. So we're here living in a three-dimensional world, which translates into a memory capacity requirement of order of 250 gigabytes. And that's obviously not going to fit into a single device. So again, you have the need to actually parallelize that. Again, we started to look what are the strategies which could be applied in order to parallelize it. The simplest one is to just do a one-dimensional domain decomposition. But we also were worried that at some point, when you start to do a one-dimensional domain decomposition, that in this one dimension, I mean, the local extent of the grid becomes too small. And so what we did is to do a model analysis to compare what happens in case of a one-dimensional and a two-dimensional domain decomposition. The model was relatively simple. It was basically what I would call, say, an information flow analysis, assuming that whenever you exchange the data, that it is governed by a latency bandwidth model. And what you can see here on the right is a comparison of the actual measured performance results for one MPI rank 2, 4, 6, and 8. And the dashed line which is shown here, that gives you the result from the model, and you can see that the model gives, say, reasonable good description of the data. And so based on this analysis, we could then make a decision that a one-dimensional domain decomposition is sufficient for this application. So the takeaway message is that in case you can afford it and your application is sufficiently simple, which is the case here, I mean, performance models can really help you to fix the parallelization strategy. The next application goes under the name of GPU MAFIA. It's subspace density clustering. These are methods which you use in order to analyze very high dimensional data sets and to find clusters within these data sets. So, I mean, clusters means that you have, say, for instance, here, not particular high dimensional space here, just shown 3 dimensions, and in these 3 dimensions you have somewhere an area in this space where you have more points than in the other parts. This is something which you can apply, for instance, here for Monte Carlo simulations of protein folding. The data which is generated there, I mean, needs to be analyzed, and by looking when they have some clusters in there, that provides you physical information. And actually, the plot which is shown over there comes from these kind of Monte Carlo simulations. But it has actually much broader application field from data mining and marketing, bioinformatics, and medical imaging. MAFIA itself stands for Merging of Adaptive Finite Intervals, and the basic idea behind that is that if you have a cluster of points in k dimensions and you map it into any of the k-1 dimensions, then you should also find a cluster there. And now you can reverse it by basically starting from one dimension, look for any kind of clusters by constructing histograms, and then going up in the dimensions, try to identify higher dimension clusters. And one of the optimizations which have been done from an algorithmic point of view is that you have adaptive grids, such that if your data is a bit larger fragmented, that it still is very efficient. But as you can see here, the main computation quote-unquote what you have to do is to actually construct histograms. Now, again, here's some performance results obtained on a single dual Xeon node with either only using the CPUs, where the performance results are shown here on the top right, or the same system where we just used a single Xeon core plus a K20X, and the performance are shown here on the bottom right. Please be aware that, I mean, here the time is shown for analysis of a certain dimensional data set with 100,000 points. And what is shown here is depending on the dimension of the subcluster, I mean synthetic data, so we could vary the dimension of the subcluster. It shows you here the execution time. Now the execution time here, the axis goes from 0 seconds to 14 seconds, and just here from 0 seconds to about 2 seconds. So it's an order of magnitude difference in terms of execution time when you just run it on the CPUs or when you run it on a CPU plus a GPU. And that can make quite a significant difference if you want to do a more interactive analysis, so that for realistic data sets the researchers in our lab were interested in, they could do the processing in the order of 1 minute, and that really gives you some kind of an interactive speed for data analysis. Last application which I want to present here, that's actually a kind of a future application. It's about a future high energy physics experiment, PANDA, which is part of the FAIR accelerator, which is currently being built in Germany in a city very close to Frankfurt, in Darmstadt. And basically what you do in these high energy physics experiments, I mean, you have a beamline, and depending on what kind of experiment it is, it can be different particles which are, say, moving around, could be electrons, could be protons, like in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And in this experiment there will also be protons, but also ions, which are then going along a beamline through a detector, as it is shown here. I mean, this is the future PANDA detector, and then inside the detector, basically you smash these particles on top of each other, and a lot of events will occur, which you have to analyze. And so what they want to achieve is that you can do a so-called triggerless track reconstruction. I will try to explain a bit later what it actually means, but the challenge which I have is that there is a very high data rate which comes out of this out of these systems. So they expect to have a data rate of about that there are about 20 million events per second, translating into a data rate of 200 gigabytes per second, which needs to be analyzed. And then in this analysis, they want to achieve a 1,000 times data reduction, so that a much smaller amount of data actually is then leaving the experiment. Now, we are currently looking into using GPUs for this purpose. Why using GPUs? Well, in the past, for these kind of tasks, typically FPGAs were used because they are fast, and you can, but you have to implement things because things are implemented in hardware. But it has the disadvantage that they are not that easy to program. And when you would use processing devices and basically do everything as software, you are much more flexible. You could, of course, use CPUs, but there might be, say, performance limitations, and additionally, also latencies turn out to be much more predictable for CPUs. And here you have to sustain a certain data rate. There are different algorithms in which you can apply to this problem. Now let me briefly explain the problem which you have. Now assume you have the beamline which is coming here into the center, in the origin of this two-dimensional cut through the experiment, and there's some event happening and new particles are generated which are then moving out of the detector. Now inside the detector, I mean, you don't see this line here, but you see here that at sensors, if you like, detect then that some particle has passed this location. And track reconstruction means that from having the information of these red points, you find out that these actually are lying on a single line along which the particle was leaving the detector. Now, there are different algorithms of how you can do this kind of reconstruction. The simplest one is a half transformation, which is also quite popular and common in any kind of imaging. A bit more special for this kind of purpose is a so-called triplet finder. I mean, where you look at where did you see a hit, and then you look in the neighboring area, has there also been a hit? And once you find, say, 3 or more hits in a neighborhood, you say, okay, here really something happened, and from then you reconstruct then the path to the origin. A slightly different approach is taking the Riemann tracker, where you map it onto a Riemann space. And at the moment we are focusing here on this triplet finder, and what we have seen here that we would be able, to get to a speed of slightly less than 1 microsecond per hit. Now, there are many hits, or 100 hits per event, and remember that we have to somehow be able to process 20 million events per second. So still, as of today, we would need more than 1,000 GPUs to actually sustain this event rate, but we still have a couple of years' time until this experiment is going into operation, and we are quite confident that this can be brought down to, say, something of the order of 100 GPUs. So we are here close to a proof of concept that really a very high event rate processing for this kind of purposes can be achieved. So let me finish with a summary. I very briefly introduce you to the Nvidia Application Lab at Jülich, which I still believe to be a very fruitful model for collaboration of an academic side and Nvidia. We had done quite some work on multi-GPU parallelization, which in most cases is required because you want to enlarge your computing power, but in the applications we had here, the main purpose was to bypass, to overcome the device memory limitations. I have introduced you two applications, the U-Brain image registration and BCOM, a finite difference time domain application. And in a kind of second part, I showed you to data-intensive applications on GPUs that might be a more new type of applications, which strongly benefit from the improved L2 atomic support on Kepler. The applications which I have introduced to you, GPU MAFIA clustering, and data mining approach, and the Panda track reconstruction, that is an application which will hopefully help to analyze then future experimental data coming out of a high energy physics experiment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dirk. I haven't been able to get to the online community questions, so I'm going to start with theirs, and then I'll come to the live theater. So one of the online questions is, when new projects start at the center, do you start parallelizing using OpenACC, or do you start directly using CUDA?
Well, it depends. I mean, here we are working together with the application developers, and it depends on the application itself, whether we believe it to be suitable for using OpenACC to parallelize it, or whether it's better to have a CUDA approach. It also depends on what are the boundary conditions set by the application developers in terms of portability and maintenance of this code. Our experience so far with the application we have been looking at, I mean, most of the application developers favored to use CUDA in order to have, say, highest bandwidth, highest performance for the application kernels.
Okay. And the second question was, could you expand on your comment, GPU latencies more predictable than CPUs? They found that to be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the reason for that is that typically on the CPUs you also have an operating system running, so you have much more processes running than on the GPU, which typically you have only one process running on the GPU, and that's why it's much more predictable how the GPU behaves. So if you look at the execution time of your application on a CPU and a GPU, then you will see that for the CPU, I mean, that will vary a little bit around a medium value. Well, on the GPU, there's also a little bit of a jitter, but it will be much more peaky.
Any questions here in the theater for Dirk?
About this question of latency, so the GPU itself is probably very precise in latency, but then when it goes over the PCI Express, is it still very precise when it goes back to the CPU?
Well, that depends eventually how the GPUs are going to be integrated inside the experiment, and that's where, say, the experimentalists, which are, say, involved in building up this experiment, are still working on, and we are not sure, I mean, what kind of solution they are going for. Personally, I could imagine that, I mean, eventually, say the data is coming over a network to some device which has to translate it into PCI Express packets. And you could imagine that you have to write this data directly into the GPU so that again you have quite good control on the data rate into the GPU. This is going to be a bit tricky because a single GPU will not be able, I mean, to sustain this data rate. So what you basically have to do is that you have to cut the data into time in time direction and then send packets over to several GPUs. So you have a kind of a resource scheduling which is required here. But I think from a hardware point of view, it should be able, I mean, to still preserve this this feature.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dirk, for joining us here in the theater.
Thank you.